Scary telling.
I screamed, cried, and wailed as my daughter was lowered into the ground inside her casket. It was the worst day of my life, a day that I would never forget. After the funeral, I returned home, feeling empty and broken. I couldn't bear the thought of going on without my daughter, but I knew that I had to somehow find the strength to keep going. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. I tried to keep myself busy, taking long walks in the park and spending time with my family and friends. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One day, I decided to visit my daughter's grave. It had been weeks since I had been there, and I knew that I needed to pay my respects. As I walked through the graveyard, I noticed a strange man standing by one of the graves. He was dressed in tattered clothes and was covered in dirt and grime. I tried to ignore him and continue on my way, but he called out to me. "Hey, you," he yelled. "You looking for something?" I shook my head, trying to get away from him. But he followed me, his eyes wild and manic. "You know, I can help you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I can make it so that nobody will ever know." I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I ran out of the graveyard as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. But that wasn't the last I would see of the graveyard keeper. In fact, it was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I began to notice the graveyard keeper everywhere I went. He would appear out of nowhere, his eyes fixed on me, as if he was trying to tell me something. At first, I tried to ignore him, but then he began to approach me more directly. He would whisper in my ear, telling me that he could make my pain go away, that he could make it so that nobody would ever know. I knew that something was wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he could help me. I was desperate for anything that would make the pain go away. And so, one night, I met the graveyard keeper at the edge of the cemetery. He was holding a shovel, and his eyes were glinting in the moonlight. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. I nodded, not sure what I was getting myself into. He led me deep into the heart of the cemetery, to a dark, forgotten corner that seemed to be shrouded in shadow. He began to dig, his shovel slicing through the earth with a dull thud. I watched in horror as he pulled out a small, rusted box and opened it to reveal a pile of bones. "These are the bones of the forgotten," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They have no one to mourn for them, no one to remember them. But you can change that." He offered me a dark deal in exchange for my silence. He would give me the bones, and I could place them in my daughter's casket, fooling everyone into thinking that it was her buried there. I knew that it was wrong, but I couldn't resist the temptation. The pain of losing my daughter was too much to bear, and I would do anything to make it go away. I took the bones and placed them in my daughter's casket, and sure enough, nobody suspected a thing. But as time went on, strange things began to happen. At first, it was just a feeling of unease whenever I was near the cemetery. But then, I began to hear strange noises coming from my daughter's room at night. I would hear her voice, whispering to me from beyond the grave. I tried to ignore it, but the voices grew louder and more persistent. They would follow me wherever I went, haunting my every waking moment. One night, I woke up to find my daughter standing at the foot of my bed. But it wasn't really her, it was something else, something dark and twisted. It told me that I had made a grave mistake, that I had unleashed a dark power that I could never control. It spoke of ancient curses and evil spirits, of vengeful ghosts and demonic possession. I knew then that I had to put a stop to it, to somehow undo what I had done. But I didn't know how. I was trapped, caught in a web of my own making. Then, one day, I received a strange message in the mail. It was from the graveyard keeper, and it was a warning. I had opened a door that I could never close, and that I had unleashed a darkness that would consume me if I didn't act fast. He told me of a ritual that could reverse the curse, a dark and dangerous ceremony that would require me to sacrifice something precious to me. I knew then what I had to do. I gathered the necessary ingredients and performed the ritual, sacrificing a part of myself in the process. And just like that, the voices stopped. The haunted bones were silenced, and I was free from the curse that I had unleashed. But I knew that the graveyard keeper was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. And I knew that I could never escape the darkness that I had brought upon myself. After I killed his doppelganger, he cheerfully said, "How did you know it wasn't me?" Those words sent a chill down my spine. I had always suspected that there was something off about him, something that made me uneasy. But I never could have imagined that he had a doppelganger. I first encountered the doppelganger when I was walking home from work one day. I saw him across the street, and for a moment, I thought it was my friend. But as I got closer, I realized that it wasn't him, it was someone who looked exactly like him. I tried to ignore it, but the more I saw the doppelganger, the more unnerved I became. And then, one day, I saw them both together. It was like looking into a mirror, seeing two identical versions of the same person standing side by side. I knew then that something was terribly wrong. I did some research and discovered that doppelgangers were believed to be evil spirits, ones that brought bad luck and misfortune to those who encountered them. So when I had the chance to kill the doppelganger, I took it. And yet, my friend seemed to take it in stride, as if it was no big deal. I tried to confront him about it, but he just laughed it off. He seemed to think it was all some kind of joke, that I was just being paranoid. But I knew better. Those things have no idea how much I hate him. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about my friend. He seemed distant, preoccupied, like he was hiding something from me. And then, one day, he disappeared. Just vanished without a trace. I searched high and low for him, but he was nowhere to be found. It was like he had never existed in the first place. But then, a few weeks later, I received a strange message in the mail. It was from my friend, and it contained a single sentence, "I'm sorry for what I've done." I was baffled. What had he done? And why was he apologizing to me? I tried to contact him, but he didn't respond. And then, one night, I received a phone call from a stranger. It was a woman's voice, one that I didn't recognize. She told me that she had information about my friend, but that I had to meet her in person to get it. I agreed, and we arranged to meet at a deserted parking lot on the edge of town. When I arrived, I saw her standing by a car, her face hidden in the shadows. But as I got closer, I saw that she wasn't alone. My friend was with her, his eyes dark and empty. He had changed. He was no longer the cheerful, carefree person I had known before. Instead, he was cold and distant, like a stranger. And then, the woman began to speak. She told me that my friend had made a deal with the devil, that he had sold his soul for fame and fortune. But the devil had betrayed him, and now he was trapped, unable to escape the darkness that he had brought upon himself. And then, my friend spoke. He told me that he had done it all for me, that he had wanted to give me the life that he could never have. But it was too late. The devil had claimed him, and there was no going back. I left that parking lot feeling shaken and scared. I had always thought that my friend was just a little odd, but I had never imagined that he was capable of something so dark and twisted. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on here, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. After my friend's disappearance and the strange encounter with the woman, I became obsessed with uncovering the truth behind his deal with the devil. I spent countless hours researching the occult and the supernatural, trying to find any information that could shed light on what had happened. And then, one day, I stumbled upon a strange ritual that was said to break curses and lift demonic possessions. It involved finding a specific type of flower that only grew in a remote part of the forest and performing a complex set of incantations and offerings. I knew that it was a long shot, but I was desperate. I had to try something to save my friend. So I set out into the forest, following the instructions that I had found online. It was a treacherous journey, full of dangers and obstacles, but I pushed on. And then, after hours of hiking, I finally found the flower that I was looking for. It was a beautiful and delicate thing, with petals that shimmered in the sunlight. I collected as many as I could carry and then made my way back to the city, where I began to perform the ritual. It was a complicated and dangerous process, but I was determined to see it through. I chanted the incantations, burned the offerings, and waited for a sign. And then, something happened. I felt a presence in the room, something dark and malevolent. It was like the air had thickened, like I was suffocating. I pushed on, ignoring the fear that was creeping up inside me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence was gone. I collapsed on the floor, exhausted and drained. But I knew that something had changed. I could feel it in my bones. The next day, I received a phone call from my friend. He sounded different, like he had woken up from a long nightmare. He thanked me for trying to save him, and then he told me that he was moving away, starting a new life somewhere far from here. I tried to protest, to convince him to stay, but he was adamant. He needed to leave, to start over. And then, just before he hung up, he said something that sent shivers down my spine. Be careful, my friend. You never know what kind of deals you might make. After my friend's departure, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still not quite right. The ritual had lifted the curse, but it had also awakened something within me, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I became obsessed with the occult, spending every free moment delving deeper into the mysteries of the supernatural. And then, one day, I received a phone call from a stranger. It was the woman from the parking lot, the one who had told me about my friend's deal with the devil. She had information, she said, about something that I might be interested in. We arranged to meet at a dark and dingy bar on the edge of town. She was sitting in a corner booth, her face half hidden by the shadows. As I approached, she handed me a small, leather-bound book. It was old and worn, with strange symbols and glyphs etched into the cover. This is what you're looking for, she said. But be careful. The price of knowledge can be steep. I opened the book and began to read. It was filled with spells and incantations, instructions on how to summon demons and control them. I was horrified and fascinated all at once. I knew that I shouldn't be messing with this kind of thing, but I couldn't help myself. And then, something strange began to happen. I started to feel like I was being watched, like there was something lurking in the shadows just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the book, but the feeling only grew stronger. And then, one night, as I was reading the book in bed, I heard a voice. It was soft and whispery, like the rustling of leaves. But it was also chilling and menacing, like the hiss of a snake. I looked around the room, but there was no one there. And yet, the voice continued to speak, whispering words that I couldn't understand. I tried to ignore it, but the voice only grew louder, more insistent. And then, suddenly, everything went dark. The room was consumed by a thick, black fog, and I could feel something cold and slimy wrapping itself around my body. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped, helpless, at the mercy of whatever was lurking in the shadows. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog was gone. The room was quiet, still, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew that something had changed. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, the day that I became a father. But when I walked into the nursery and saw my son's lifeless body lying in the crib, my world fell apart. I screamed, cried, and wailed as I held his cold, still form in my arms. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. And then, as I was about to call for an ambulance, I noticed something strange. There was dirt on his tiny hands and feet, as if he had been digging in the ground. I didn't understand. My son had been born only a few days ago. How could he have been digging? And then, as if in a daze, I stumbled outside, and that's when I saw it. There was a hole in the ground, a fresh grave, right next to my son's nursery. I was horrified. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Someone had dug up my son's body, only to return him to the crib as if nothing had happened. I called the police, but they couldn't find any evidence of foul play. No footprints, no fingerprints, nothing. It was like the person who had done this had vanished into thin air. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, something even more shocking happened. My son opened his eyes. It was like a miracle. One moment he was lifeless, and the next he was alive and kicking. But it wasn't a miracle. It was something far more sinister. I knew that something had changed, that my son was not the same as he had been before. And then, just as suddenly as he had opened his eyes, he began to cry. A deep, guttural cry that sent shivers down my spine. I knew that I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I was a father, but I was also a man, and I was terrified. In the weeks that followed, my son began to change. It was subtle at first, but soon it became impossible to ignore. He stopped crying, stopped making any noise at all. His eyes, once bright and curious, became cold and lifeless. And then, one night, as I was sitting in the nursery watching over him, something happened. My son's body began to twist and contort, as if he was in agony. I tried to comfort him, but he pushed me away, his tiny hands cold and clammy. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the transformation was over. My son's body had changed. His eyes, once a bright blue, were now a deep, menacing red. His skin was pale and waxy, like that of a corpse. I knew that something was wrong, terribly wrong. But I couldn't bring myself to call for help. It was like I was under his spell, like I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't escape from. And then, things began to get even worse. I started to see things, strange and terrifying things, lurking in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But soon, I realized that it was something far more sinister. Something was watching us, following us, waiting for its chance to strike. I tried to protect my son, to keep him safe from whatever was out there. But I soon realized that I was fighting a losing battle. The creature that had taken over my son's body was too powerful, too evil. And then, one night, it finally happened. The creature revealed itself, emerging from my son's body in a cloud of black smoke. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, a creature of darkness, with long, twisted horns and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. I knew that I had to do something to fight back against this creature that had taken over my son's body. But I didn't know how. I was just a man, facing off against a creature from beyond the grave. As the creature from my son's body advanced towards me, I knew that I was in trouble. It was like I was frozen in place, unable to move or even scream as the creature closed in on me. But then, just as it was about to strike, I remembered something. A ritual passed down through my family for generations that was said to banish evil spirits back to where they came from. I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try. With shaking hands, I began to recite the words of the ritual, the ancient language flowing from my lips like a river of power. At first, nothing happened. But then, just as I was about to give up hope, the creature began to scream, writhing in pain as the words of the ritual took hold. It was like a storm, a battle between good and evil, with me at the center of it all. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm was over. The creature was gone, banished back to where it came from. But my son was gone too. The body that had once housed his innocent soul was now just an empty shell, lifeless and cold. I knew that I had to bury him, to put him to rest once and for all. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed help, someone who could help me perform the ritual that would send my son's soul to the afterlife. And so, I turned to the only person I knew who could help me, my father. He was an old man, with deep lines etched into his weathered face. But he was wise, and he knew the ways of the ancient rituals. Together, we performed the ritual, the words of the ancient language flowing from our lips like a river of power. At first, nothing happened. But then, just as we were about to give up hope, we felt it. A presence, a warmth, spreading through the room. It was my son, his soul finally at peace. I knew that he was gone, but I also knew that he was at peace. And that was all that mattered. In the days that followed, I tried to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. But it was hard. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of my son, of the life that he could have had if things had turned out differently. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. I started to have nightmares, vivid and terrifying visions of my son's body rising from the grave, of the creature that had once inhabited it returning to wreak havoc on the world once again. At first, I thought it was just my guilt, my fear of what I had done to my own son. But then, I realized that it was something more. Something was still out there, still watching, waiting for its chance to strike. I knew that I couldn't face it alone. I needed help. And so, I turned to my father once again. Together, we performed another ritual, one that was said to protect the living from the dead. At first, I was skeptical. But then, as the words of the ritual flowed from my lips, I felt it. A warmth, a light, spreading through the room. It was like a shield, protecting us from whatever was out there. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the ritual was over. The creature was gone, banished back to where it came from. But I knew that it wasn't over yet. I knew that there would always be more darkness out there, waiting for its chance to strike. But I also knew that I wasn't alone. That I had my family and my faith to protect me. And so, I began to rebuild my life, one step at a time. It wasn't easy, but nothing worth having ever is. I knew that I would never forget my son or the horror that I had faced. But I also knew that I would never give up, that I would keep fighting until my last breath. For him and for all those who had gone before him.